So I don't know how this works. Am I supposed to stand up or sit down or be kind of? I may. I mean, if I get tired. Yeah, my favorite. Yeah. Great. Cool. Keep it cash. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. So this is the first of three sessions, and I actually have to thank Ryan because the presentation I'm going to talk about tonight evolved out of the youth group, because I talked to the youth group and out of a concept called My Story. And that was sort of an interesting evolution of my Alpha Talk into My Story, which I'm going to talk about tonight. But what I'm going to try and do tonight is emphasize some of the issues and struggles I had in early career days. I'm not that early anymore, as you can tell. But just to kind of give you a sense about that. And essentially, my story is about being alone and holding on to the past. When it really comes down to it, I mean, I have parallel stories, and so you're going to see a parallel story evolving out of tonight, out of my talk tonight. But essentially, it was about being alone and holding on to the past. But what you're going to hear tonight is that God had different plans for me, and He had a much bigger plan for me along the way. And I look back over my life, and I can see how God has been wooing me over the course of the last however many years I've been around. So I'm going to talk about a number of issues tonight, and it's a bit of a tapestry. And I'm going to return to this image on the next slide at the end of my presentation. But you might want to ask yourself if you can see an image in that particular tapestry. Some of you may be able to, and some of you may not be able to. It might be clearer by the end of the presentation. So when I talk about being alone and holding on to the past, when I was young, a big thing for me was pictures and really important places. And I'll talk a little bit about what my childhood was like. But for many, many, many years, probably about 30 years of my life, which represents 60% of my life, this picture of Toronto Harbour was kind of like the epitome picture for me. It was the ultimate picture, and it was taken on a particular July night in 1979 with a friend of mine. We were out sailing, and there was this really gorgeous sunset in Toronto Harbour, and I took this picture. How many of you have been to Toronto? A few have, so you may have actually been to this place. And for years, that picture really crystallized something for me, and it really spoke to me. But the problem was, it was kind of all part of me being really dramatic, melancholy individual. And even when you look at some of the songs I listened to, such as I still am a big Elton John fan, but back then he had a song called Curtains. And one of the lines in the song Curtains was, there's treasure children always seem to find, but just like us, you must have had a once upon a time. So it was like all this kind of drama, and you kind of like get the sense we've got this beautiful picture, this beautiful sunset, and all this drama, and I was really holding on to this picture, and pictures like it, for a long, long time. And lyrics such as this, it wasn't about happy, joyful lyrics, it was all about these kind of sad, pathetic lyrics about, once haves and used to be and that sort of thing. But that started to, when I look back at my life, I can see that God was going after me in a way that would speak to my particular heart. And one of the things that's really, really important as a Christian, and you may have heard this before, or you may not have, is that you build a secret place between you and Jesus. And if if you listen to any Jesus Culture podcasts or follow any of their conferences, that's going to be a reoccurring message that you hear from the Jesus Culture group and their ministry. It's all about building a really, really strong foundation of understanding God. And what that means is prayer and reading the Bible and spending quiet time with you. Never mind witnessing, never mind being the hands and feet, but it's all about having a foundation between you and Jesus, a secret place. And when I look back on my life, I see that actually I used to spend, I'll talk a little bit pathetically in a few minutes about how much time I spent. But I can see now how God has actually taken this desire that I have for the kind of melancholy and the dramatic pictures and that sort of thing, and the ambiance, and turned it into a way of creating sacred places for me where I can go and build that secret place with Jesus. And I know that that works for me. That really speaks to me. That I need to find kind of, some people, they can kind of open up a Bible anywhere and fire themselves into the Bible on their iPhone in the middle of the MTR kind of thing. I need like a quiet place with all the right kind of lights and the right kind of music in the background, all that kind of ambiance. So that's one part of the piece. But during that time, when I would see pictures like this, I was very much holding on to the past and very much focused on, I was very much alone. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a while. So flipping ahead though to the next slide, I actually, despite the way I sort of framed my talk about being alone and holding on to the past, I actually had a very lucky and privileged life. I had great, loving parents. They were quite strict, but I had very, very loving parents. My dad was a doctor. I had two older sisters who were very, very caring. And I had summers at the yacht club, and I had winter skiing in Ontario and Canada, and holidays, here and there. I had a good education, and I had lots and lots of opportunities. So I was very, very fortunate in that regard. And the interesting thing about this particular picture is that I actually didn't find this picture until I've been attending Union Church since 2001. And in 2007, when we were putting together a photo album for my dad's 80th birthday, this family picture surfaced out of nowhere. This was me when I was about 4 or 5 years old, even older than the triplets. You might see running around on Sunday. But does anyone notice anything interesting about this particular picture? Pardon me? Sorry? Yeah. There's someone watching me in the background. So I didn't even see that. So we were putting together this digital photo album. We're calling it was a big surprise for my dad. We're contacting people, and they were sending in emails and photos. And all of a sudden this photo arrived and went into the photo album. And we spent weeks putting together this huge book. And in the middle of this whole thing, I realized that my sister was actually in the background watching me. And for me, in my particular walk with God back in 2007, that really struck me. It wasn't so much that my sister was watching me, it was that someone else was watching me. Because I always had a sense in my life that someone was watching me, and that person was actually God. And I've had this wooing. I'll talk about wooing a little bit more in the next couple of slides, but I had this wooing constantly going on. I constantly felt that Jesus was there, and I had this kind of, some people call it a guardian angel, but I had someone constantly watching me and protecting me. And if I had more time, or if I get invited back after tonight and the next 2 weeks, I have lots and lots and lots of stories of just unbelievable kind of near catastrophes, car accidents, stuff like that, where I'm convinced there was divine intervention that protected me along the way. So I was aware that I was constantly being watched. Anyway, life moved on, and in the next shot, I talked about good opportunities. And one of the things we did when I was 6 years old is my family took a 7-month sailing trip from Toronto down to the Bahamas. There were 5 of us on a 28-foot sailboat. and I did correspondence courses. My mom was my teacher for 7 months, and it had a very, very, very powerful defining impact on my life. Partly because there was tons and tons of confidence, but also there was the smell of the sea. And even now, when I go down to salt water and I smell the sea, it draws me back to the Bahamas. And so I had a sense of being very carefree. And this was not the boat that we were on, but it was a friend's boat that we found that we visited along the way. And so that was a very powerful event in my life. Now, when we came back from that trip, we did attend church. And this is actually what the church looks like. And believe it or not, the inside of that church looks exactly as I remember it from when I went to church. Now, at the time, we started going to church before we went south on our trip, and then we continued to go to church after we went south, only for a couple of years, and then we stopped going to church. And I guess you could say in a way I became the prodigal son, because I started falling away from God, despite this constant calling. But when I went back to this church and finally found their website about 6 or 8 months ago, and found the inside of the church, I was struck at how much the church looked exactly as I remembered it. And what I also remember about going to church was how unbelievable the stories were. And I remember going and learning about Genesis and the creation of the world, and by that point I knew that Santa Claus was real, and I hope that's not a surprise for any of you. But I just found the whole thing a little bit unbelievable. And along the way we stopped attending church, and I did not know why that actually happened. But one of the things that I asked my parents when I was probably around a teenager, or maybe a little bit later, I asked them why we stopped going to church, and I was told that that the pastor had started delivering a message that my mother actually didn't agree with, and that really puzzled me. And years later, when a young student, some of you might know of this family, but a young student died in Hong Kong at about 14 or 15 years old, very, very suddenly. And when she died, Tess, my wife, was blogging about the incident. And the one thing that this family had assurance of was that this girl had gone to heaven. And Tess blogged about the fact that the funeral, which was held in the family doesn't attend this church, but the funeral was held in this church. And Colin was up there delivering a eulogy, and he talked about the assurance of knowing that Megan had gone to heaven. And Tess blogged about that, and my sister wrote me and said, well, what makes you think that she wouldn't go to heaven? And I was really stuck in this theological conflict. Well, why would she or why would she not go to heaven? And I actually phoned up Pastor Greg. I was on the committee management at the time, so I phoned up Pastor Greg and I said, and then of course when we realized it's me on the phone, it's kind of like, oh no, what's happening now in the committee management? But I said, actually, Greg, I have a theological question for you. And it's this, my sister and I are in this kind of debate right now about how do people get to heaven. And he said, well, actually, and he kind of answered the question for me about why my mother might have stopped choosing to go to this particular church. He said that there's a book called 5 Paths to Heaven. Has anyone here read that book? And then one of the paths to heaven, they're all paths to heaven through the context of Christ. But one of the paths to heaven is what's called universal salvation, which means basically you're baptized as a baby, God is all forgiven, and you have a green light, don't pass, you go straight to heaven, despite what your sins may or may not be. Whereas other paths to heaven, as children grow up, they hit what we call an age of accountability, and they can choose to follow Jesus, and sin becomes more significant in their lives. And the church that was one of the churches that's really championing universal salvation is the United Church of Canada. And it was like this huge shroud got pulled back against me, and I had this great, great understanding of my whole history of going to church and my background. Another thing that I learned along the way, my mother actually grew up in Antigua, and she went to a very, very strict high Anglican church. There were times she told me she used to go to church as often as 6 times a day. Her church was right across the street from the school that she went to. It was actually, they were kind of connected. And I went back and visited that church in Antigua, and I can see how they definitely would not follow the view of universal salvation. So anyway, along the way, we stopped going to church. But despite that, I continued to sense a calling whenever I read the Bible. I continued to sense a calling, but whenever I read the Bible, I couldn't really hear it. Have you ever had that expression where you read things and it's kind of blank? Like you may not understand what's going on. I was definitely in that category. And my family has this family Bible. It's about 75 years old. It's one of the few, living in one of the things you give up, being from another country, is you as my dad's moved out of things and moved out of houses and so on, I had to kind of give up claims to old furniture I loved and that sort of thing. But one of the things I've held on to was this family Bible. But whenever I read this Bible or other Bibles, and this one's a really beautiful Bible with wonderful pictures inside, whenever I read the Bible, I couldn't hear it. It just didn't connect with me. And that's significant because of the continuation of the story of God knowing me. So one of the things that was happening through my life was that God would continue to woo me. He would continue to come to me through different avenues. So for example, he would come to me through gorgeous sunsets, or he would come to me through the kindness of a friend, or he would come to me through unexpected parking spots, which continue to happen to this day. I often ask my kids to pray as we're coming to church on a Sunday, please pray that we get a parking spot. And then we'll pull in under the flyover here underneath Coventry Drive, and amazingly we'll have a parking spot. Even through YouTube, there's a book out there called Walk on YouTube, which is about U2's walking with God. And what really shocked me was when I found out that Alice Cooper is a Christian. Because if you can believe it or not, when I was about 12, 13, 14 years old, I was a huge Alice Cooper fan. And I'm not talking about Alice Cooper the way he looks here. I'm talking about Alice Cooper the way he used to look in the 1970s and the 1980s in his rock band, with his whole get-up and his whole dark Dracula type draconian look. So there was this constant wooing that kept on happening throughout my life. But despite the wooing, most of my activities had me being alone. All the activities I was involved in were activities about being alone. So my friend, a very good friend of mine who's known me for most of my life, used to joke that I suffered the legacy of a lonely long-distance runner. So that's me on the left when I was about 17 years old. And I was also a skier. But they were all activities about being alone. And during that time I did a lot of writing, I'm very much an introvert. Now I'm more of a socialized extrovert. What that means is I'm more of an extrovert, but at heart I'm an introvert. An extrovert comes from learning to be an extrovert. I used to do a lot of writing, and I had this kind of game that for every journal that I wrote, it represented 1 year of my life. So there was a time when I would have written more journals in my life than I had years of age, and I thought, okay, well, that means I'm older than I really am, kind of thing. So it's kind of that whole kind of ridiculous drama thing going on. But actually, sometimes in my Bible, I wrote to God. And in my real surrender, I guess you might say the return of the prodigal son, in my surrender to Christ, one of the things that I came to realize was that my desire for answers, I had a lot of questions about Christianity, but my desire for answers were less important than the relationship with God. And I recognized that when I did have those moments, the kind of near close have those particular moments, my default paradigm was God. My default paradigm was Christ. When I was really in trouble, when I had no one to turn to, when I really thought catastrophe was there in my face, my default paradigm was Christ. And therefore, I realized that there was no, for a long time I fought Christ when I kind of went off on this journey and then came back. And I realized there was no point fighting anymore. Because deep inside I really wanted it to all be true. And you've seen in this picture that I was a runner. But also one of the ways I got wooed was through the movie Chariots of Fire. Maybe you've seen that movie, Chariots of Fire, or heard of that movie. It has really, really inspiring music. And one of the songs is Jerusalem. And in that song, one of the lines is, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green?" And we all know, no. I mean, feet as in Jesus. And so basically the insinuation is that Jesus walked on England's land. And we know that that's not true. But what's worse is I'm from Canada, so Jesus didn't go anywhere near Canada. But I wanted to think that he was walking with me, or that he was walking anywhere that I had walked. What I didn't realize was that he was walking with me all along, kind of the footprints in the sand story, that he was actually walking by my side, and have had a lot of insights into how Jesus has been with me throughout my life, which has been really profound. So that was kind of, into the teens. This whole story of kind of being alone and but God continuing to woo me. And then another thing that started to really weigh down on me as I had this kind of bit of a prodigal son experience, drifting away from God, is I always thought that God was disappointed in me. I always thought that God was disappointed in me. And that was a huge barrier between me and God. What I didn't understand growing up in the paradigm of religion that I grew up in, even though during the close calls my default paradigm was God, what I didn't realize was that God forgave me. And when I came to Hong Kong, that was a huge revelation when I started meeting Christians in Hong Kong and I did the Alpha course. And it was more about how much God loved me and how much God loved others, as opposed to that God was disappointed in me. And I had no concept that God forgave my sins. That was lost on me. And many people think that there are little sins and there are big sins, and that a lot of people think that the little sins are like harmless bee stings, and that the big sins are like terrible shark attacks. And so lots of people think that, well, I can get away with the little white lies, but I can't get away with serious, terrible shark attacks. Shark attack sins, really serious sins that might kill you or prevent you from going to heaven. But how many people do you think globally die per year from bee stings? Any idea? 1 million? Not quite that many. Probably 1 million have severe, whatever they call anaphylactic attacks and end up in the hospital. And any idea how many, well there you go, there's the answer. Globally, about 100 people die each year from bee stings. And 5 people die from shark attacks. So the big sins and the little sins, really, they're all sins. For me, I always thought that God was disappointed with me. I thought I could get away with the little sins, the little white lies, and steer clear of the big sins. But was wrong. And I had a real moment of truth when I heard a sermon in this church, actually. What some people know about me is I was actually previously married. And Tess is actually my second marriage. And I didn't understand that either, and God's view on divorce. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, now I've got like a shark attack scene. I'm really in big trouble. But fortunately I was in this church and I had a good relationship with people around me so that I could learn that Jesus forgave me for that. One of the things that happened in the middle of all this next slide. So I failed my second year of university. So for me, that was a bit of a big sin. And I had a really, really hard time coping with that. So one of the things that's really important in your career is that you develop a very powerful relationship with failure, so that you can actually learn from failures and share about failures. So I failed my second year of university, and probably I didn't tell, well, it took me months to tell my parents that I failed, and I probably wasn't able to freely tell people that that had happened to me for about 7 or 8 years. You know, I made up a big story about what had happened at university. I took a year off, is what I said. But ultimately, the end of the story was I got thrown out of school. I worked very, very hard to convince them to let me back in a year later. And then I completed my degree and I did very well. But despite that success, I still really couldn't cope with telling people about that failure. So it's very, very important in your career that you get a strong relationship with failure, because failure is going to happen. It's a fact of life. And you need to understand how to cope with failure and how to have people around you that you can share failure with. I was a lonely person, isolated person, and I did not have people that I could share failure with. I really didn't have people that I trusted. So that's really important. But in the middle of all that, I got a call. And I got a very, very, very powerful call, overwhelmingly supernatural call from God. And fought it and fought it and fought it and thought, no, this is impossible. What happened was I had a friend going into ministry, and I was standing at the door of my residence about to fail university. And I thought to myself, wow, Lord, what would happen if I went through a similar experience? And you know, when you kind of have that liquid love feeling going over you, when you're in church or in something like the walk to Mass, or someone's praying over you, or you have some kind of strong insight. So I just had this liquid love that washed over me, and I had this really powerful experience. But despite that, I resisted that experience, and I went off, and it was mentioned earlier that I have a bit of an entrepreneurial background, so success started. And I started my own business, which actually started before this particular time period. So when I took my year off from school, I ran my business. And then I had a lot of success with that business, even to the point that when I was in my early 20s, I was on the front cover of Canadian Business Magazine. So it was quite a successful business. So that's not Photoshop, that's the real deal from August 1984. And at the same time, other things happened. I started sailing a lot and racing a lot, and suddenly I was on a team and I was no longer suffering the legacy of the lonely long-distance runner. And a journey started throughout my career in Canada that took about probably 10 or 12 years. And during that journey, God continued to move me with secret places. I continued to write. I continued to have the sense that God was protecting me and being a lighthouse for me in my life. And that He was very much breaking up the loner. So God would put in place would put in my path ways to kind of break up the loner and start to go to work on my heart to be more accepting of people and more open to people. He got me unhooked from my past. He started putting Christians in my path, which was quite fortuitous. And He started putting Christian circumstances in my path, and He started putting Christian ethical dilemmas in my path, which again tested the paradigm that I was living in, that when it came down to close calls, I would default to God. And He really started changing my heart and ear towards the Bible and developing me into a leader. And then my career hit a crossroads. I had the opportunity to go back to school, which is something I've wanted to do for a long, long time. So I went back to graduate school and I did a graduate diploma in Asia Pacific Management. And the next thing I knew, I ended up in Hong Kong. And that was in probably, maybe one of the first, who knows, but it was 1996, 97. We first met, what the story is that she was actually in the alumni of the graduate school the year after I went, and they had a very advanced internet system. In fact, they used the cloud, even though Apple and Google have coined the cloud as something new today. In reality, they were using virtualization for all this chat stuff. And so Tess and I were chatting on the internet. And to make a long story short, we ended up together in Hong Kong, and we got engaged and we got married. But during the 2 years that we were together and engaged before we got married, Tess and I had a relationship threatening to fight. And I was on a business trip in New Zealand, and I was jet lagged, so traveling in the Southern Hemisphere is always hard for me. And I was really, really scared that I was going to lose her. Really scared. So what did I say I would do during the close calls? During the close calls, I would go to Jesus. So I was lying there on my bedroom, on my bed in my hotel room in New Zealand. Very, very vividly, it was, I hadn't even unpacked, I just was under this exhausted business travel. I was lying on the bed. Tess and I had a call. She was super upset, and I thought, this is it. This is the end of the relationship. And I opened up the drawer, and what was sitting there in the drawer was a Gideon's Bible. The good old Gideon's. I picked up the Bible, and I started to read it. And for the first time in my life, the Bible spoke to me. So it's as if God had cleared out all the cobwebs, and He had changed my heart, and He had changed the way I listen, and He changed the filters of being alone, and He changed the filters of holding on to the past, and He had kind of set me up in a way and put me into a dilemma where the default paradigm was to reach out to God and to actually read the Bible. And so that's what I did. And I was absolutely blown away and amazed at how powerful it was. So Tess and I got married, and then the next thing that happened is we started having kids. And this next picture, does anyone want to take a guess where this next picture was taken? Anyone recognize this? This is the K10 ward of the Queen Mary Hospital, which is where I sat when the triplets were born. And the triplets were born at 26 weeks gestation, 3.5 months premature. There were 16 doctors and nurses in the hospital. They were born by emergency C-section. I was not allowed to be in the room. And I sat on that windowsill, and I was just really, really, really traumatized. Now, God had been going to work on my heart. My normal, automatic way of being would be to be alone. And I said, I heard this voice in my head say, you should not be alone right now. You should have someone with you, praying for you. And I sent a text message to a guy named Dale Wellington. And I said, please come. He already knew we were at Queen Mary Hospital because we've been sending out the red alerts all weekend long because Tessa got into preterm labor. And Dale came to the hospital and with Stephanie and spent the rest of the day with me in the hospital. But I sat on that windowsill when the triplets were born. This was the size of their feet when they were born. They were super small. In the next picture. And so they were about roughly a pound each. Karis got a life-threatening illness about a month later, and she was very, very sick. She had a condition called aspergillosis, which is a hospital-acquired condition when you start to grow fungus on your lungs. You know, when you hear people dying of complications of AIDS and things like that, it's usually because they're being bombarded with so many antibiotics that their aspergillosis gets into the system and kind of takes over their system. And I remember very, very clearly the doctor saying to us, she's going to die. She's going to die within the next 24 to 36 hours. We need to talk to you now about what's going to be involved in pulling the plug, because when it comes to pulling the plug in 24 to 36 hours, you'll be so beyond yourself and so outside yourself, you won't be able to pull the plug. You won't be able to do anything except pull the plug. So he walked us through the whole thing, Tess had to leave the room. And 24 hours later, I went back into the hospital to hear what the doctor was saying about Karis. And he said Karis is getting better. So I had a long discussion about why that was the case. And finally, he just stopped me and he said, to be honest, I'm unable to clinically explain why she's getting better. And in that moment, right then, I had one of those liquid love experiences that I talked about earlier, and really felt that I was in a secret place with Jesus. And so this is that previous picture of the windowsill. It's a sacred place for me. Karis got well. She started fighting back, and she's, if you look at this next picture here, that's what she's, the next picture. That's her second from the right, the little blonde girl next to the blonde girl on the right. That's Karis about a year ago. So she's, will be turning 9 in a couple of weeks, and some of you may have seen her around church on Sundays. But God continued to go to heart, to work on me, because I was still attached to things in the past. And one of the things I was attached to in the past was family properties that my family had. So my mom died in 2001, but my dad had a family property and it just got too big for him. One of the questions I had was, where's home? Living here in Hong Kong, kind of always wondering, Tess and I always wondering, when should we be going back to Canada? Should we be going back to Canada? And one of the questions was, where's home? So this particular picture here, this was our family farm, and if you just animate it once, my dad sold the farm. And we never thought, my sisters and I never thought that would slip out of the family. So that was emotionally really hard, because for me, the farm was one of those sacred places. And then, you go to the next slide, my dad was living in this house. I lived in this house for most of my life, up until leaving Toronto. And he lived in there for about 46, 47 years. And then he phoned me up one day, and I knew this was happening. And he said, I gotta sell the house. Selling the farm, selling the house, all happened within 18 months. That was a real rug pulling experience. Then you go to the next, on Tessa's side of the family, they had a summer property that they used to go to. And guess what happened? That summer property is no longer available to the family because it is being sold. So and this all happened within a very, very close period of time. So here I was in Hong Kong, thinking to myself, where's home? So if you go to the next slide, along the way, I started realizing that God was teaching me a lesson of where home was, and I should be trusting in Him. And that actually, my home is with Jesus. And yes, this scripture is about how Jesus is preparing a home for us in my Father's house. And that really, really spoke to me. And that was remember when I talked about what do I do during the close calls, or what do I do in those troubled moments, is go back to Jesus and go back to God. And so I really have been able to find comfort in the fact that my home is with Jesus, my home is with God. So if I leave you with one final message, it will be that nothing can separate us from the love of God. And one of the things I did was I went back to that picture and superimposed a picture of stained glass window, which represents the body of Christ. Not because I particularly liked it, but because it represents me being part of the body of Christ. I have people around me that support me and pray for me, and not having a story of being all alone and holding on to the past. So my question for you is, in the concluding moments, to think about it, or if you have any questions, you can ask me. Do you have a secret place? Are Christians being put in your path? Are Christian circumstances being put in your path? Can you hear the Bible? And if not, how can that change? What could you do differently to hear the Bible? I had this really, and then last one is how is Jesus moving you? I had this really interesting thing happen. Do you remember, did any of you hear Steve talk a couple Sundays ago? The guy from Union Church, Manila. And I actually have tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears. Have you heard of tinnitus? Most of the times it doesn't bother me, and most of the times I'm not even aware of it. But when I'm in a really quiet, secret place, it gets louder. And I asked Steve to pray for my tinnitus, and there was a distinct improvement in my tinnitus on that Sunday. And then I realized that the further away from God I get, the louder the tinnitus gets. And the more I spend in prayer and around people, Christians supporting me, the quieter the tinnitus gets. So that was, I guess he talked just after Christmas. So this is like a 2 to 3 week revelation for me that I figured this out. And Sebastian, my son, who goes to youth groups, and monitoring every morning, asks me how my tinnitus is. When the stress is loud and I'm not around Christians, the tinnitus is loud at home. So that's my story. Discussion question.
Okay. Charles. So we've got 5 minutes to go through the discussion. Let's probably break up into groups of 4. So we turn our chairs around. I don't know if we have time to do all 5 questions. Maybe we'll do 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, or pick the one that maybe speaks to you the most.
Yeah. So if we could just break into groups of 4 and I guess have someone lead that, and we'll